Emily Tran stood on the uneven cobblestones outside the Magnolia Grand Hotel, clutching the rusted keys in her hand. The building loomed before her, its weathered facade and broken neon sign whispering tales of better days long gone. To most, it was an eyesore, a relic of a forgotten era. But to Emily, it was something more, a mystery waiting to be unraveled. "Emily, dear," called a familiar voice, dripping with insincerity. Her Aunt Margaret emerged from a sleek black sedan, her perfectly styled hair untouched by the humid air. "You're not seriously considering keeping this wreck, are you?" Emily turned to face her aunt, her expression unreadable. Behind Margaret, her cousin Derek stepped out of the car, adjusting his designer sunglasses as he surveyed the dilapidated building with disdain. "Face it, Emily," Derek sneered. "Grandpa Henry must have been out of his mind leaving this dump to you. It's worthless." Emily clenched the keys tighter in her hand but said nothing. She knew what they thought of her, the quiet one, the black sheep of the family who had walked away from their corporate empire to forge her own path as a forensic accountant. But she also knew something they didn't: numbers never lied. "Dinner's at 7, Margaret continued as she slid back into the car. "We'll discuss the estate then. And Emily, do try to look presentable." Emily watched as the car disappeared down the street before turning back to the hotel. She took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy doors, stepping into the dimly lit lobby. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint glow of sunlight streaming through cracked stained glass windows. Beneath layers of grime and neglect, she could still see traces of its former grandeur: marble floors hidden beneath faded rugs, crystal chandeliers dulled by time. "Miss Emily!" a voice called out from across the room. It was Luis, the elderly bellhop who had worked at the hotel for decades. He hurried over, his face lighting up with relief. "We've been waiting for you," he said. "How many staff stayed?" Emily asked softly. 12 of us," Luis replied proudly. "The core team. We weren't sure what would happen after Mr. Henry passed." "You did the right thing staying," Emily said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Is his office still sealed?" Luis nodded solemnly. "Just as he left it. Though your cousin Derek tried to get in last week." Emily smirked faintly. "I'll bet he did." Emily made her way up to the mezzanine level, where her grandfather's office overlooked the lobby through frosted glass windows. The memories came flooding back, afternoons spent here as a child, watching him work while she did her homework at his massive oak desk. "A hotel isn't just a building," Grandpa Henry used to say with a twinkle in his eye as he showed her ledgers filled with neat rows of numbers. "It's a theater where every guest's story plays out. Our job is to make sure their story has a happy ending." Those words echoed in her mind as she opened the office door with its familiar creak and stepped inside. Everything was exactly as she remembered: the desk, the wall lined with leather-bound ledgers, and the old safe that had fascinated her as a child. But something was different this time. The safe door was slightly ajar. Her heart quickened as she approached it cautiously. "Luis," she called down the stairs, "did anyone manage to open this?" "No, Miss Emily," Luis replied firmly from below. "Your cousin tried, but no one knows the combination." Emily stared at the safe for a moment before reaching out to touch its cold metal surface. Her grandfather had taught her how to open it on her 16th birthday, a combination made up of 3 significant dates: the hotel's opening day, her grandmother's birthday, and the day he paid off its mortgage. As she turned the dial and heard each click fall into place, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger than herself. The safe opened with a soft groan, revealing not just stacks of papers, but also an envelope with her name written in bold, cursive letters: Emily. She hesitated for only a moment before tearing it open and unfolding the letter inside. "Dear Emily," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan." Emily carefully unfolded the letter, her hands trembling slightly as her grandfather's familiar handwriting came into view. The words seemed to leap off the page, carrying with them a weight she hadn't anticipated. "Dear Emily," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan. You've inherited the hotel, and our family thinks it's worthless. Perfect. She couldn't help but smile at the dry humor tucked into his words, but as she read on, her curiosity deepened. What they don't know, the letter continued, is that the Magnolia Grand isn't failing, it's thriving, but not in a way they'd ever understand. The ledgers on the wall show what I wanted them to see. This book, he wrote, referring to the leather-bound ledger now in her hands, shows the truth. Before you open it, you need to understand why I chose you for this inheritance. You see patterns others miss. You understand that numbers are just symbols for something deeper. Most importantly, you know that true value isn't always visible on the surface. Emily's pulse quickened as she turned the letter over and read his final instructions. The Magnolia Grand has a secret, one that would destroy everything if it fell into the wrong hands. That's why I needed everyone to believe it was failing, and why I needed you to take over. Read this ledger carefully, then go to room 1207 at exactly midnight. What you find there will explain everything. She sat back in her chair, staring at the sealed ledger in front of her. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to hear what she would do next. The weight of her grandfather's trust settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left me speechless, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you truly believed in, something others thought was worthless, hit that like button. Because trust me, this story is just getting started. Taking a deep breath, Emily opened the ledger and began flipping through its pages. At first glance, it looked like any other financial record, columns of numbers neatly organized into balance sheets and transaction logs. But as she studied it closer, she realized this was no ordinary ledger. The entries were coded in a way only someone with her forensic accounting skills could decipher. Payments from numbered Swiss accounts appeared alongside cryptic notes referencing something called Project Legacy. There were mentions of artifacts, historical preservation efforts, and even detailed records of guests who had paid exorbitant sums for stays in specific rooms, including room 1207. Her heart raced as she reached the final page of the ledger and spotted a handwritten note from her grandfather. The real treasure isn't in the numbers, it's in what the numbers are protecting. Find the basement key. Everything else will make sense then. Emily leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, letting everything sink in, the safe, the letter, the ledger, and now this new clue about a basement key. Her grandfather had always been a man of secrets and surprises, but this? This was something entirely different. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, breaking her concentration. It was a text from Aunt Margaret, dinner in an hour. The family has a very generous offer for that wreck of yours. Emily smirked at her aunt's persistence and typed back quickly, sorry, can't make it tonight. Too busy being poor and worthless. She placed her phone back down and turned her attention to the room around her. Somewhere within these walls was a key that would unlock everything, her grandfather's secrets, his vision for this hotel, and perhaps even a part of herself she hadn't yet discovered. As she stood up and began searching through drawers and hidden compartments in his office, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something monumental, something that would change not only how she saw this hotel, but how she saw herself. And so began her search for answers, a journey into shadows cast by history itself, and little did she know just how deep those shadows would run. Emily's heart raced as she carefully examined the ledger and reread her grandfather's cryptic instructions. Find the basement key, he had written. But where could it be? She began searching every corner of his office, pulling open drawers, flipping through books, and feeling along the edges of furniture for hidden compartments. The room was quiet except for the faint creak of the old wooden floor and the occasional rustle of paper. Then, as her fingers brushed against the underside of the desk, she felt it, a small, cold piece of metal taped securely to the wood. Her breath caught as she peeled it free and held up an antique brass key with a faint inscription, "Every story needs a foundation." Her grandfather's favorite saying echoed in her mind as she turned the key over in her hand. It was old but sturdy, its weight reassuring. She knew this was it, the key to whatever secrets he had buried beneath the hotel. But where was the entrance to the basement? The building plans she had reviewed earlier showed no sign of any lower levels beyond a standard utility area. This wasn't just a basement, it was something deliberately hidden. She left the office and made her way back down to the lobby, where Louise was tidying up near the front desk. "Louise," she called softly, holding up the key, "do you know anything about a private basement? My grandfather mentioned it in his letter." Louise glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "Miss Emily," he whispered, "there's only one way down there, a service elevator hidden in the back storage area. Mr. Henry always said it wasn't for anyone else to see." He hesitated, then added with a knowing smile, "Your cousins tried to find it last week, but, let's just say I forgot to mention where it was." Emily couldn't help but laugh softly at Louise's loyalty. "Thank you," she said warmly. "I think it's time I see what he was hiding." The storage area Louise directed her to looked unremarkable at first glance, just a cluttered space filled with old furniture and cleaning supplies. But as Emily moved aside a heavy shelf, she noticed something unusual, a metal panel embedded into the wall with a faint outline of a keypad next to it. Above the panel, barely visible in the dim light, were etched words that made her pause, "Every story needs a foundation." Her fingers hovered over the keypad as she thought back to her grandfather's safe combination, the 3 dates that had unlocked so much already. She entered them carefully: June 12, 1947, the hotel's opening date, March 15, 1925, her grandmother's birthday, and October 1, 1980, the day he paid off the mortgage. With a soft beep, the panel clicked open, revealing a hidden elevator door. Emily stepped inside cautiously, her pulse quickening as she pressed the only button on the control panel, down. The elevator shuddered slightly before beginning its descent. She watched as the floor numbers disappeared from view on the small screen above, B1, B2, B3. It kept going deeper and deeper until finally stopping at what seemed like an impossibly low level. When the doors slid open, Emily gasped audibly. What lay before her wasn't just a basement, it was an entirely different world. The air was cool and crisp, maintained by state-of-the-art climate control systems. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched out in every direction, each filled with artifacts carefully preserved under glass cases or wrapped in protective coverings. Paintings hung on walls illuminated by soft lighting, their vibrant colors untouched by time. Ancient manuscripts rested on custom-built stands alongside sculptures that looked like they belonged in world-class museums. Emily stepped forward slowly, her eyes wide with wonder. This wasn't just storage, this was a museum hidden beneath her feet. As she moved further into the space, she noticed detailed labels on each item, provenance records, historical notes, and even restoration details meticulously documented. Her forensic mind raced to piece together what this all meant. The ledger's references to Project Legacy suddenly made sense. This wasn't just about preserving history, it was about recovering it. Impressive, isn't it? A voice broke through her thoughts. Startled, Emily spun around to see an elderly man standing behind her. He wore an impeccably tailored suit and carried himself with quiet authority. "Who are you?" Emily asked cautiously. "Dr. Alan Pierce," he said with a warm smile. "Your grandfather's partner in Project Legacy, and now yours." Before Emily could respond, Dr. Pierce gestured for her to follow him deeper into the underground facility. As they walked past priceless artifacts and historical treasures from every corner of the globe, he began to explain. During World War II, he said softly, countless cultural artifacts were stolen, paintings ripped from walls, sculptures looted from museums, entire libraries burned or taken by force. His voice grew heavier with emotion as he continued. Many of these pieces were never recovered, until your grandfather decided to do something about it. Emily listened intently as Dr. Pierce described how her grandfather had used the Magnolia Grand Hotel as both a cover and a hub for their operations. Wealthy guests who stayed in specific rooms weren't just paying for luxury accommodations, they were participating in discreet transactions that returned stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. The hotel's financial losses were deliberate, Dr. Pierce explained as they stopped in front of an intricate tapestry hanging on one wall. On paper, it looked like we were barely staying afloat, but those losses were actually operating costs for recovering and restoring these treasures. Emily stared at him in awe as everything began falling into place, the coded ledger entries, the mysterious payments from Swiss accounts, even her grandfather's insistence on secrecy. "But why keep this from everyone?" she asked finally. Dr. Pierce smiled knowingly. "Because your family would have turned this mission into a business, charging fees for returns or selling artifacts outright." He shook his head firmly. "To your grandfather, and now to us, this was never about money. It was about justice." Emily felt tears prick at her eyes as she absorbed his words. Her grandfather hadn't just left her an old hotel, he had entrusted her with a legacy far greater than anything she could have imagined. And yet, there was still more to uncover. "Why did he tell me to go to room 1207? Emily asked quietly. Dr. Pierce's eyes twinkled with amusement. "That," he said simply, "is where it all began." Emily stood frozen as Dr. Pierce's words sank in. The underground museum stretched endlessly before her, a labyrinth of history hidden beneath the hotel she thought she knew. Each artifact seemed to radiate its own story, its own tragedy, and its own triumph. Her grandfather's vision was far greater than she had imagined. This wasn't just about preserving history, it was about rewriting it, restoring what had been stolen, and giving justice to those who had been wronged. Dr. Pierce gestured for her to follow him as he walked deeper into the museum. "Project Legacy," he began, his voice calm but filled with conviction, "was your grandfather's greatest achievement. During World War II and the decades that followed, countless cultural treasures were stolen, paintings ripped from walls, sculptures looted from museums, entire libraries lost to greed or war." He paused beside a glass case containing a delicate golden chalice. Many of these pieces were never recovered. Some ended up in private collections, others were destroyed or forgotten. Your grandfather couldn't accept that. Emily's breath caught as she took in the magnitude of what she was seeing. "So he created this operation?" she asked softly. Dr. Pierce nodded. The Magnolia Grand became more than just a hotel, it became a sanctuary for stolen artifacts and a hub for their recovery and return. Wealthy guests who stayed in specific rooms weren't just paying for luxury accommodations, they were participating in discreet transactions to reclaim their family's lost treasures. Emily's mind raced as she pieced together the clues from the ledger and the hidden elevator ride that brought her here. "The coded entries in the ledger," she murmured, "the Swiss accounts, they were funding this?" "Exactly," Dr. Pierce replied with a faint smile. "Your grandfather was brilliant at creating layers of protection. On paper, the hotel looked like it was barely surviving, its losses were deliberate, masking the true purpose of this place. Every dollar spent here went toward recovering stolen artifacts or supporting families who couldn't afford to fight for their heritage." Emily stopped in front of a large painting, a serene countryside scene with vibrant colors that seemed almost alive despite its age. The label beneath it read, "Recovered from private collection, returned to rightful heirs in 2017. She turned to Dr. Pierce with tears in her eyes. "He never told me any of this," she whispered. "He couldn't," Dr. Pierce said gently. "Your family would have turned this into a business, charging fees for returns or selling artifacts outright. To your grandfather, this was never about money. It was about justice." Emily felt a swell of pride mixed with sadness as she thought about her grandfather's quiet determination to protect something so important from falling into the wrong hands. She glanced around at the rows of artifacts, each one representing not just an object but a piece of someone's identity restored. "But why room 1207? Emily asked after a moment. Dr. Pierce's eyes twinkled with amusement as he led her toward a staircase that spiraled upward into the shadows. "That," he said with a hint of mystery, "is where it all began." As they ascended the stairs, Emily couldn't help but feel like she was stepping further into her grandfather's world, a world he had carefully built and protected for decades without anyone knowing. When they reached the top floor, Dr. Pierce stopped in front of room 1207 and handed her an old brass key. This room, he said quietly, was your grandfather's command center, the heart of Project Legacy. Emily inserted the key into the lock and pushed open the door. The suite looked unassuming at first glance, elegant furniture, soft lighting, and luxurious decor typical of a high-end hotel room. But as Dr. Pierce began pointing out hidden compartments and concealed panels, Emily realized this space was anything but ordinary. Behind one panel was a high-tech scanning device used to authenticate paintings and sculptures on site. Another concealed drawer held detailed files on families who had been reunited with their stolen heritage thanks to Project Legacy's efforts. This room allowed your grandfather to work directly with clients, families who had spent generations searching for what was taken from them, Dr. Pierce explained as Emily examined the equipment with awe. She turned back to him with a question burning in her mind: why did he choose me to inherit all of this? Dr. Pierce smiled warmly, his expression filled with both admiration and certainty. Because you see what others overlook, he said simply. You understand that numbers tell stories, and you have the heart to protect those stories. Emily felt tears welling up again but blinked them away as determination took hold of her heart. Her grandfather had entrusted her with more than just a hotel, he had given her a mission, a legacy worth fighting for. As she stood there in room 1207 surrounded by tools of justice disguised as luxury amenities, Emily knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning of her journey to carry forward what her grandfather had started. And somewhere deep within her soul, she could almost hear his voice whispering, every story needs a foundation. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the Magnolia Grand Hotel as Emily sat calmly in the lobby, her heart steady despite the storm she knew was about to arrive. She had spent the entire night preparing, reviewing documents, organizing evidence, and mentally bracing herself for what was sure to be a heated confrontation. The echoes of her grandfather's words lingered in her mind: every story needs a foundation. Today, she would lay that foundation, not just for herself but for the legacy he had entrusted to her. The sharp click of heels on marble floors signaled their arrival. Aunt Margaret swept into the lobby like a queen entering her court, followed closely by Derek and their team of lawyers. Their faces were masks of triumph, their confidence radiating as if they had already won. Margaret's voice rang out, cutting through the quiet elegance of the space. Emily, she began, her tone dripping with false sympathy. We've given you every opportunity to be reasonable about this situation. But since you've refused to cooperate, we've taken matters into our own hands. Derek smirked as he dropped a stack of legal documents onto the front desk. We're contesting the will, he announced smugly. Grandpa Henry was clearly not in his right mind when he left this wreck to you. Emily stood slowly, her expression calm but resolute. Good morning to you too, she said evenly, ignoring Derek's jab. She gestured toward a group of impeccably dressed individuals seated nearby. Before we get into that, let me introduce you to some very important people. Margaret's confident facade faltered as she turned to look at the group. One man stood and extended his hand with a polite smile. Dr. Alan Pierce, he said smoothly. I'm the chairman of the Magnolia Grand's board of directors. Board of directors? Derek scoffed, his brow furrowing in confusion. This place is bankrupt. No, Emily corrected him, her voice firm and unwavering. This place is the headquarters of the Legacy Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to recovering and returning stolen cultural artifacts. Margaret blinked in disbelief. What are you talking about? Emily stepped forward, holding up a thick folder filled with meticulously organized documents. For years, Grandpa Henry used this hotel as more than just a business, it was a cover for something far greater. The losses you saw on paper? They were operating costs for Project Legacy, a multi-billion-dollar recovery operation that has helped reunite families with their stolen heritage. Dr. Pierce chimed in, his voice calm but authoritative. Your father wasn't failing, he was succeeding at something far more important than profit. He opened another folder and began distributing documents to Margaret's lawyers, financial statements, international awards, letters of gratitude from families whose lives had been changed by Project Legacy. As they flipped through the pages, Margaret's composure began to crack. Derek's smirk disappeared entirely as he scanned one letter after another, each one detailing how an artifact recovered by Project Legacy had been returned to its rightful owners. "This can't be real," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, it's very real," Emily said softly but firmly. She stepped closer to her aunt and cousin, meeting their stunned gazes head-on. "Grandpa didn't tell you because he knew what you'd do with this information. You'd turn it into a business, charge fees for returns, maybe even sell artifacts outright." Her voice grew stronger with each word. But this was never about money for him. It was about justice. Margaret sank into one of the lobby chairs as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Derek opened his mouth to speak but seemed at a loss for words. Emily turned back toward Dr. Pierce and nodded slightly. He stepped forward again and cleared his throat before addressing Margaret and Derek directly. "The Foundation's work will continue under Emily's leadership," he said firmly. "Your father always intended for her to take over, not because she was his favorite but because she has the skills and integrity needed to protect this mission." The room fell silent except for the faint rustle of papers as Margaret's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Margaret looked up at Emily with an expression that was equal parts defeat and reluctant admiration. "All this time," she murmured, shaking her head slowly, "we thought." "You thought what you were supposed to think," Emily said gently but firmly. "Grandpa needed people to underestimate this place so he could protect its real purpose." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Derek broke the silence with an unexpected question: "Is there anything we can do to help?" Emily studied him carefully before answering. "If you're serious about helping," she said slowly, "there's always work to be done, legal battles over ownership claims, navigating international art laws. We could use someone with your expertise." Derek nodded solemnly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something resembling humility. Margaret remained silent but finally gave a small nod of acknowledgement before standing and smoothing out her skirt. "I'll leave it in your hands," she said quietly before turning toward the door. As they left the hotel, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. She turned back toward Dr. Pierce and smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said simply. He returned her smile with one of quiet pride. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said softly. Over the next year, under Emily's leadership, the Magnolia Grand underwent a transformation, not into something new but back into what it had always secretly been, a beacon of hope and justice disguised as a historic hotel. The public areas were restored to their former glory while the underground museum expanded its operations, recovering more artifacts and reuniting more families with their lost heritage. Even Margaret became an unlikely ally in promoting the Foundation's work within Chicago's social circles, while Derek proved invaluable in navigating complex legal cases involving stolen artifacts. One evening, as Emily sat alone in room 1207 reviewing new entries in Project Legacy's ledgers, she found herself reflecting on how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. Her grandfather had once told her that every story needs a foundation, and now she understood what he meant more deeply than ever before. True value isn't measured in profit margins or property values, it's measured in the lives we touch and the histories we preserve. And so the story of Project Legacy continued, one artifact at a time, one family at a time, each chapter building on the last to create something truly extraordinary, a legacy worth protecting forever. Emily entered room 1207, the suite her grandfather had called the heart of the Magnolia Grand. At first glance, it was unremarkable: plush carpets, elegant furniture, and a faint scent of aged wood. But as she moved deeper into the room, she began to notice the subtle details, the faint seams in the walls, the hidden panels that blended seamlessly with the decor. This wasn't just a hotel suite, it was a command center. Behind one panel, she found scanning equipment designed to authenticate paintings and sculptures. Another concealed a compact lab for analyzing pigments and materials. The desk drawers held files, meticulous records of families who had been reunited with their stolen heritage. Emily's fingers brushed against one letter, written in shaky handwriting, thanking her grandfather for returning a family heirloom lost during World War II. Each word carried a weight of gratitude that made her chest tighten. On the desk lay an envelope with her name on it. She opened it carefully, revealing her grandfather's familiar handwriting. "Dear Emily," it began, "this room is where it all started. Every artifact recovered, every family reunited, it all passed through here. I built this place to be more than just a hotel, I built it to be a sanctuary for truth and justice. Now it's yours." Her eyes scanned the room again, this time with fresh understanding. This wasn't just a workspace, it was a legacy. Every tool, every file, every hidden compartment was a testament to her grandfather's mission to restore what had been lost and protect what was priceless. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway, his presence quiet but steady. "How does it feel?" he asked. Emily took a deep breath, her voice steady, despite the emotion swirling inside her. "It feels like I finally understand him," she said softly. Dr. Pierce nodded and gestured toward another hidden panel she hadn't yet opened. "There's one more thing you should see." Emily pressed against the panel, revealing rows of letters preserved in protective sleeves. She pulled one out and read it carefully, a heartfelt note from a man whose family had been reunited with a painting stolen decades ago. Each letter told a similar story: loss, hope, and eventual restoration. "These letters," Dr. Pierce explained, "are proof of what your grandfather accomplished. They're not just about artifacts, they're about healing wounds that time alone couldn't mend." Emily felt tears sting her eyes as she placed the letter back in its sleeve. Her grandfather hadn't just left her a hotel, he had left her a mission, a responsibility to continue writing these stories of recovery and justice. She turned back to Dr. Pierce with renewed determination. "This isn't just a room," she said firmly. "It's the heart of everything he believed in." Dr. Pierce smiled faintly. "And now it's yours." As he left her alone in room 1207, Emily stood still for a moment, letting the weight of her grandfather's trust settle over her shoulders. She knew there was still so much work to be done, so many artifacts waiting to be recovered, so many families waiting for their stories to be restored. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to simply stand in the quiet space that had been her grandfather's sanctuary, a place where history found its way home and where justice was quietly served. Room 1207 wasn't just where it all began, it was where Emily's own story would continue to unfold. The Magnolia Grand Hotel began its transformation not with a wrecking ball or flashy renovations, but with purpose and quiet resolve. Emily stood in the lobby on the first morning of her leadership, watching as sunlight streamed through the restored stained glass windows. The echoes of her grandfather's vision filled the space, and she knew this was more than just a hotel, it was a second chance for history itself. The public areas were carefully restored to their former glory, maintaining the hotel's charm while subtly modernizing its infrastructure. Beneath the surface, however, the real work began. The underground museum expanded its operations, becoming a global hub for recovering stolen artifacts and reuniting them with their rightful owners. The once hidden basement now buzzed with activity, historians cataloging treasures, conservators restoring fragile pieces, and legal experts navigating complex international claims. Emily worked tirelessly alongside Dr. Pierce and the Foundation's team. Together, they refined Project Legacy's operations, ensuring that every artifact was authenticated and every family's story was honored. The ledger her grandfather had left behind became her guide, each entry a roadmap to uncovering new mysteries and restoring lost heritage. Surprisingly, Derek proved to be an invaluable ally. Once he understood the mission's true purpose, his legal expertise became instrumental in navigating international art law and resolving disputes over ownership. Even Aunt Margaret, after initial resistance, became one of the Foundation's strongest advocates in Chicago's social circles, using her connections to raise awareness and funding for their work. 1 year later, the Magnolia Grand stood proud, not as something new but as what it had always secretly been, a sanctuary for justice disguised as a historic hotel. Guests came and went, unaware of the treasures hidden beneath their feet or the lives being changed behind the scenes. For Emily, that was exactly how it should be. Late one evening, Emily sat alone in room 1207, reviewing new entries in Project Legacy's ledger. Each line represented not just an artifact recovered but a life touched, a family healed by the return of something they thought was lost forever. She leaned back in her chair and let her eyes wander around the room that had once been her grandfather's command center. It still felt alive with his presence. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. An elderly woman entered hesitantly, clutching a small photograph in her hands. "Ms. Tran," she said softly, "I was told you could help me." Emily gestured for her to sit and took the photograph gently from her hands. It was an image of a painting, an oil portrait of a young girl with haunting eyes. The woman explained how it had been stolen from her family during World War II and how she had spent decades searching for it. Emily smiled reassuringly and activated one of the room's hidden panels, revealing advanced scanning equipment. Within minutes, they had confirmed that the painting was indeed part of Project Legacy's collection. When Emily handed the woman confirmation of its recovery, tears streamed down her face. "My grandfather did this, for your family," Emily said softly. "And now it's my honor to continue his work." The woman reached out and squeezed Emily's hand tightly. "He told me once," she whispered through her tears, "that everyone deserves to know their story." As the woman left room 1207 with hope rekindled in her heart, Emily sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. The Magnolia Grand wasn't just a hotel anymore, it was a beacon of hope for those seeking to reclaim their pasts. Its true value wasn't measured in profit margins or property appraisals, but in the lives it touched and the histories it helped restore. Every morning before the hotel awoke, Emily would walk through the underground museum alone. Each artifact told its own story, of loss and recovery, of pain and healing, and each reminded her why this work mattered so deeply. One day while organizing old files in her office, she discovered a note from her grandfather, tucked behind one of his ledgers. Written years ago in his familiar handwriting, it seemed to speak directly to this moment. "Sweet pea. A hotel isn't just bricks and mortar, it's a keeper of secrets, a guardian of stories. Some stories are written in ledgers, others are hidden in artifacts we protect. But the most important story is the one we write by helping others reclaim their pasts. You'll write these next chapters better than I ever could. Love always. Grandpa." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she folded the note carefully and placed it back where she found it. Her grandfather had trusted her with more than just his legacy, he had trusted her with his dream. Today, under Emily's leadership, Project Legacy continues to thrive. Families from around the world are reunited with pieces of their history, artifacts once thought lost forever find their way home, and justice is served quietly but powerfully within the walls of the Magnolia Grand. To most people passing by on the bustling streets outside, it is simply an elegant historic hotel restored to its former glory. But to those who know its secrets, and those whose lives have been changed by its work, it is so much more. The Magnolia Grand Hotel stands as a testament to what truly matters, not wealth or appearances but stories, stories that heal wounds, preserve heritage, and remind us all that some legacies are worth protecting at any cost. And like every great story, this one is far from over.